Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers, de pays étrangers.
This is the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast. I am Jesse Martineau. Now, this week's guest is Mélissa Baril, the driving force behind an incredibly exciting project that I'm looking forward to speaking about, New Detroit. In addition, Mélissa is the creator of another really cool project, Caribou lunettes, which I am very much looking forward to discussing. Mélissa was also a contributing author to the book French All Around Us, which remains one of the coolest things I have done since being part of this podcast. Mélissa, welcome to the French Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Hi, Jesse. It's a pleasure to be here tonight.
Yeah. So before we get going, you have a pretty unique personal story. I'd like to start with that. I don't think it's going to be very hard for our listeners to detect right away you are not originally from Detroit with that accent. So can you just give us a background? Where are you from?
Correct. I'm not from Detroit. I'm from Victoriaville in Quebec. And then I worked in Montreal and Toronto before moving to the suburb of Paris because my husband is French. And after 15 years in Paris, we moved to Detroit 7 years ago now.
Now, why Detroit?
The automotive, I guess, really original for the city.
Did you obviously your English is great. Did you speak English growing up?
I learned English at school. And my dad had a business working with wood and plywood. So he was buying his material or wood in the US, transforming it in Victoriaville and selling it back to US customers. So I've been in the US many times for my vacation. Which were driving us to meet my dad's clients at the same time. So it was a priority for my dad for us to learn English. So I went to a summer camp in Ontario first, then did some exchange program in Winnipeg and British Columbia, and then went to England to learn English. And then working in Toronto, it was quite useful too.
I would imagine. Did you ever come kind of my way over here in New England growing up?
In Maine, yes, of course, right? Yes. We were going to the beach and all the East Coast, and actually my grandparents were snowbirds. So
very nice.
And I've been celebrating many birthday in Florida.
Awesome. At Old Orchard Beach, I would imagine.
Yes, Ogunquit too.
Oh, yeah. So it is pretty funny for those who are not from New England. If you go to these places, Ogunquit or Old Orchard Beach in the summertime, you will hear French spoken all over the place.
Yes,
absolutely everywhere.
Exactly. It's the closest beach or the closest ocean for us in Quebec. So we were there a year ago, and was just a bonus because my son would have friends from Quebec, so he would just speak in French being in Maine. So that was great.
That is awesome. Now, it was funny because when I was up, again, I did 6 months in Quebec, and I would talk to people there, and that would be one of the questions I'd get when I said I was from New England. They'd be like, well, what's New England? I'd explain, it's a 6-state region. And as soon as I mentioned Maine, it'd be like, how far are you from Old Orchard Beach? And which if you're from something I never would have thought of before. That's such an attraction, Old Orchard Beach, which is really cool. So you do have how many kids? You mentioned you had kids?
3. I have twin daughters and a son.
Twin daughters and a son. Now, they're all born. I believe reading your chapter, all born in France.
Yes, all born in France. With I guess like the French accent mainly, but with some expressions from Quebec. And now they're fluent in English too.
Sure. How old were they when you guys came here?
They were almost 7 and 10. So
okay.
The younger,
how was that adjustment?
Not bad. I guess for multiple reasons, because we as parents were happy to move to Detroit. they had done some immersion programs in Paris to learn English. TV shows and DVDs, since they were watching TV, was only in English at home. So I guess they were not speaking, but their ear was prepared to hear English. It helped.
Sure. Do you guys speak French in the home now?
Only French.
I love that.
Only French at home, and then English outside.
Gotcha. And this is a question I always find fun. Do your kids speak to each other in French?
Yes. Yes. And I'm really glad, because I know many other families where brothers and sisters started to speak in English to each other.
Sure.
Because the school is in English, so it's quite natural. But at home, at my house, it's only French.
That is awesome. I think that's really cool, because like kind of what you hinted at, my parents, both of them actually grew up in a house where they spoke French kind of almost exclusively in the house, and they always spoke French with their parents. But if the parents weren't around, they were going to talk to their siblings in English, which is kind of how it worked out. So that's awesome that your kids are still doing that. That's very, very cool.
And I didn't force them, right?
Sure.
It was just natural. It was, of course, when friends are coming over, then we switch to English.
Sure, absolutely. Now, when you got to Michigan, were you able to find a French-speaking community when you got there?
Well, actually, I was surprised to find so many French speakers. I grew up in Canada, and I never knew there were French speakers in Michigan or Detroit. It's a quite diversified community. You have, of course, French expatriates from France coming for the automotive industry, mainly.
Sure.
Not only, but mainly. So there's that community, but some people decide to stay, and they've been living here for a long time. Their kids grew up here as American. You also have immigrants, a bit like New England right now, or Maine. We're hosting many French speakers, immigrants from Africa. So they are a huge community too. And you find people originally from Lebanon or from Northern Africa, like Algeria and Morocco. So it's really diversified. There are Canadians and French Canadians, but it's hard to find them. They're just hiding. But it's not like, hey, I'm French Canadian. When you find some, then it's great, because you connect. But they're more like, they don't show like upfront that they speak French or that they're Canadian.
Which again, to me, is kind of crazy considering how close you are, and it's the same thing here in Manchester, how close we are to Quebec, that you would have that difficulty finding them, but we do too.
Even here in Detroit, you just cross the border, the river, and you have Windsor, and in Windsor there is a huge Francophone community too, and French immersion schools. So and nobody knows that here. When I talk to teachers, they're always like, oh, we're looking forward to travel to Paris with our students. And I'm like, just take a bus for one day, cross the border, and you'll be immersed.
It's literally the neighboring town.
Exactly.
That is kind of crazy. Now, are there any organizations that in the Detroit or in that region that kind of help you guys find each other and connect?
Not really. And that's why I've always said that we were missing that kind of cultural center, Francophone cultural center, where we could gather and share experience. There is an Alliance Française. There are some organizations promoting the heritage for people who would like to, for their genealogy and their roots. But nothing that would be inclusive of everybody, whether it doesn't matter where you're from and how is your French? Like, we're not judging, and I always hear, oh, I'm sorry for my French, or oh, my broken French. And it's like, no, just speak it. It's great. We can communicate, then perfect.
Yeah, that's awesome. Because you wrote about that also in the chapter you did for the book, and it's wild because it just reminded me of even just this summer. I know very fortunate. I was named the Franco-American of the Year here in Manchester, and somebody was giving me a congratulations on winning that, and they spoke a couple of phrases to me in French, and I responded to them in French. And as soon as I was done talking, they turned around and they talked to my mom, and they talked about how they have a tough time listening to the French that was different than the French they grew up with. It was like this, I think she was like nails on a chalkboard, I believe is the term she used. I was like, I'm like, it was 2 seconds ago. I'm still right here. And you're right. So we'd still hear that kind of stuff a lot.
Oh,
So,
yes. Oh, yes. The insecurity, the linguistic insecurity is really deep. As even myself, my French is my mother tongue, right?
of course.
And I studied French at university too. And my job was proofreading articles and text. So I assumed that my French was at a good level. But moving to France, that's where I really discover what was linguistic insecurity. And I think that's when I really understood how important the language was for me and was part of my identity. And I think that's why moving to Detroit, it was obvious to me that I was proud to be Francophone and that I knew other people who could be prouder to be Francophone.
Sure.
So that's why from the start, I really I was really foreseeing a need for that kind of cultural center, like the new foundation was at the time, just starting in Louisiana.
Sure. Yeah, we're definitely going to talk a lot about the new Detroit, which is going to be very, very fun. But actually, you're just reminded me. Did you get did people give you a hard time about your language when you were living in France?
Yes.
So you got that a lot then.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's just again, sorry, it's just a crazy story that it reminded me of. When my mom was traveling in France, she was in line at a hotel and they were checking in, and the person in the group in front of them was from Montreal.
Mm-hmm.
And said they were trying to speak to the person behind the counter, and the person behind the counter was like, my mom was convinced, pretending not to be able to understand what they were saying, to the point where my mom the person behind the counter spoke English. So they would talk to my mom in English, but they refused to speak to the people in Quebec in the French they were speaking, to the point where my mom had to translate. So they were talking to these people from Quebec and then speaking in English to the guy from France behind the desk, would speak back to my mom in English, and then it would translate that, speaking French to the people of Quebec. And it's just craziness.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. So that's why when I meet teachers, I really focus on giving diversified tools to the kids. It can be books, of course, with the Caribou. That's what I do, but also with every kind of resources, so kids can know or hear different accents and really know that French speakers are all over the world.
And let's talk a bit about Caribou lunettes, because it's a really, really cool project. I just spent some time going through your website and all the various things you guys do and are offering, and which is really cool. So, big picture, what is the Caribou?
The Caribou à lunettes is multiple services around youth literature in French. I mainly try to support families, parents and kids, and teachers and librarians who are looking for books, and I help them find the right book for the right kid or the right level, because with French as a foreign language, I do believe you can still use authentic books, as they call it, and just adapt the title or try to find the right title for a teenagers that would be for his age and
Sure.
also for his level of French.
Where did the idea for this come from? That you're gonna start getting books together for people trying to learn French?
I read a lot, and my kids read a lot, and didn't stop when we came here. And
Sure.
I was looking for books, and I had brought books with me, talking to neighbors. Then they were all saying, well, we don't know where to find books. And I couldn't find French books around my house. So I just invited friends and neighbors on a Sunday afternoon at my place, and I just opened my boxes of books in the living room. And then the following month, I had more people and then more people. And that's how I figured out that, well, there's a need. So what can I do for that? So since I was still buying books and people started giving me books when they were, for example, moving back to France, and that's how I organized my first library in the basement. And then I had members, and they would come. And honestly, kids were choosing books, but parents were just happy to talk to other parents too. And now after COVID, I found a new location. So I have a business place with all the books, because now I'm almost at 4,000 books.
That's
so
awesome.
It's a small library, but it's for the area quite big, because it's the only one, and it's still growing. So that's how I started. I added some workshops, so kids could come and we would start from a story and do creative workshops or discussions, so that was also a good way for kids who are learning French, or kids with one parent speaking French and not the one. Then meeting other kids speaking French, it was a good way for them to encourage speaking French. It's not just mom, or it's not just dad who speak French. It's, wow, there are other people, there are other kids. And again, I always remember one kid who could understand French but not speak it. And we were doing a workshop, and he just wanted to participate. He had something to say, and I just look at him and say it in English. And then he said it in English, and that was not a problem. But at least he was participating. So that's
awesome.
That's great to see that. Yeah.
Very, very cool. Yeah, and you guys have an entire event calendar that you guys, which is really cool.
Trying to meet everybody's needs. So toddlers and elementary kids and secondary kids, and then parents too.
That's all. And before we move on, though, I got to ask, where did the name come from?
Well, actually, back in France, I was working for a communication department of a big construction company. And at one of our communication meeting, I was coming in, and one of my colleagues said, "Oh, look who's coming. It's the Caribou."
Okay.
Right? So I decided that I would assume that role, and that I would be Caribou. And then I wear glasses. So it was a Caribou with glasses.
That's awesome. That's really fun, actually. Okay, but something you did talk about, I mentioned in the intro, of course, is New Detroit. And for those who don't remember, first of all, I'm talking a new NOUS. I know a lot of people, when I first tell them, they're like NEW, and they're very, very confused. NOUS, New Detroit. We had an entire episode about the new foundation, what they were doing down in New Orleans. But before we get going too much, can you just give us kind of a refresher? What is the new foundation, and why were you interested in getting part of that?
So the new foundation was founded 3 years ago by Scott Tilton and Rudy Besnet in New Orleans to promote the French and Creole languages and cultures. Today, 3 years later, they are a cultural center, they are a creative studio, and they are an innovative fund. And since the start, I've been following them and saying, hey, we need this in Detroit too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now Here we go. We're going to launch the new Detroit in a few days, and we're going to duplicate their programs here. So, for example, they have the lab, which will be available to people in Michigan too, which is a fund. If you have a project to propose, then you can submit your proposal. We're going to duplicate also their panel discussion called Entre Nous with people from Detroit. We're going to adapt some of their programs too. They have an educational booklet for schools. They made that for their immersion schools. So we're going to adapt it for French as a foreign language for middle school and high schoolers here in Detroit with the French heritage of Detroit, who was founded by Cadillac in 1701, but also to link it to the rest of the US and also to the world. So to open up the kids to what is la francophonie around them, here in the community and in the world. And we're going to create new programs too with new needs or new ideas we're going to have from the community.
It's incredibly exciting because for anybody who has been following the growth of that new foundation from where they started to where they are today, I mean, we're talking about a couple of incredibly bright, incredibly driven people running that foundation down in New Orleans, and they have just had terrific success, and it is awesome to see now that they are expanding, which is very, very cool.
Yes, I'm really excited, and it's really great to work along Rudy and Scott. It's always new ideas, and we're just trying to make those ideas work and move forward.
And I would definitely suggest everybody kind of, if you haven't, it's been a bit since we've talked about the new foundation, check out their website. We can put links to it. And you mentioned like the lab, for example, that provides support for people working on projects. Just an example, when I pulled up the lab, one of the people getting that support from the new foundation is Brian Hawkins, who the documentary filmmaker from Missouri, to the Toujours Sit, which is what we've talked about on this before. There's that project. There's a ton of other projects like that the new foundation helps support, which is really, really awesome. In addition to all the programming they host, which is cool. And now you get to be parts.
Yes, and
of that picture.
I'm not alone in this big crazy project. So I of course work closely with Scott and Rudy, but we also have our own team here in Detroit, advising programs and the needs of the community. So I will be working with Mamba Amissi, who's the owner and co-founder of Baobab Fair. Mamba and his wife Nadia moved to Detroit. Well, actually, they were refugees from Burundi, and within a few years, they've been learning English and creating that new restaurant that is really supporting the community too. So there's also Claire Marie Brisson that
For sure.
Now a professor at Harvard, but she is from Detroit. She's from Dearborn, so she'll be working with us. And there's also Sean Gordon, who works for the Detroit Public Schools Community District, and Towela Okbudir, who's teachers of French and founder of French Lit.
That's a very, very impressive board that you have been able to put together to start off what will be a pretty exciting project.
Yes, really, really excited.
But yeah, so New is awesome. We'll definitely link everything so you guys can follow what New Detroit is up to. But before we kind of head out here, I do want to talk about some of the questions, if that's cool, that you brought up in the chapter that you wrote for your book, because you asked and then answered some what I thought were pretty foundational, pretty important questions that we like to talk about here quite a bit on the show, and even things I talk about with talk about the life I have, things I talk about with my friends all the time are some of the things that you brought up. And because I mean, for example, one of the things you talked about was, especially when you talk about your kids, the need to cultivate an attachment to your roots, while at the same time trying to develop that sense of belonging to their new country. And how did that look like for you? How did you go about trying to do that?
Well, I think the key is not to put the two languages in opposition. So again, my husband speaks French, I speak French. So it's easy to just say at home, we speak French.
Sure.
I think it would be a different challenge if my husband wasn't speaking French, for
Sure.
example. So we had that was making it easier. But again, it's not opposing a language to another one. It's just that you're going to be richer with more languages and more cultures. So you can just accept the other cultures or try to learn them, and you're going to grow with that. So it's not that you're denying your roots or denying your heritage. You can cherish that. And of course, at home, I cook like I cooked in Quebec or in France.
Sure.
Or we still listen to Francophone music, for example. We still meet friends that are from different countries but speaking French. But again, it's part of, well, let's be part of the school community. Let's participate in the activities at school, or let's participate in other activities in the community. Let's visit that festival in Detroit. And so if you really engage with your new community, but still cherish your own culture,
Sure.
I think both can work along.
That is very cool. And actually staying with the topic of engaging children, obviously I don't have any kids, but my sister Monique does. Mike, the producer, does. Good friend of mine, Tim Beaulieu, who you know, he does. So this is something we talk about quite a bit. And it's actually a question you asked specifically in your chapter, which is, how do you get the attention of kids? Like, how do you make French attractive to them so that they want to learn it?
That's a really hard question.
Yeah.
And what I say to parents or teachers here is that connect French to what they know. It has to be useful. If you're learning French only to visit the Eiffel Tower once in your life, it may be not that attractive. And here we have some areas where some kids won't probably travel outside Michigan. So why would they learn French? Well, if you connect them to resources in French next to them, just like the Caribou Library, for example, if you have them meet people like Mamba, who's from
Sure.
Africa, speaking French and still speaking French here, but who started his own business here in Detroit, then it makes it more attractive. And it's great to value the heritage. And I'm always surprised to find people, not just students, but people who do not know that Detroit was founded by a French guy. So I think we have to value that heritage, but link it to what's going on right now.
And I thought that was a major part of what you wrote. And I actually wrote that down for something I wanted to talk about, because that's something that Tim Beaulieu talks about all the time too. We talk a lot about, our past and connected to our past, which is awesome, but we don't spend enough time talking about what's next.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to not be as much of a focus in a lot of our conversation. And how do we get there? How do we get to the point where that becomes a bigger part of the conversation, and not always talking about, at least in New Hampshire, what the mills used to look like in 1940.
I'm not sure I have the right response.
It's not an easy question, of course.
No, and I don't think there's any magic wand where everything is solved in 2 minutes. I hope that with the new foundation, we'll be engaging more young people towards being proud of speaking French, even if it's not their mother tongue,
Sure.
even if it's not like the between quotes good French. So I think the new foundation is a good way to start, but without a new foundation, I think it's just like Tim did with the Poutine Fest is gathering people around something that we all like. I think once you convince one person to be proud of speaking French and trying to organize one thing, then that person will convince another person. I'm thinking about Sean Gordon, so who's on the team for New Detroit. I met him just a few months ago during a conference where I was giving that speech of be proud of your French. And he called me a few weeks after saying, you know what? I never thought I was Francophone. I never thought I could call myself Francophone, but you're right. I do speak French. My grandma was from Quebec. So I have roots. I still want to speak French. I still want to engage with people speaking French. So I said, yes, I think you can just be proud to call yourself a Francophone. And today he's working with us at the New Detroit to create new opportunity for kids to be proud of speaking French and to engage them in learning the language.
No, that's awesome. And I am glad you brought up Poutine Fest, because I think that's a really smart approach, because I think some part of the genius of what made that so successful and why Tim just further proof that Tim's a really, really bright guy is instead of, because at least around here, we spent forever putting on programming and then trying to convince the public that it's cool to come out and join us. And Tim kind of, he flipped the script on that. He took something that everybody already thought was really cool and interesting and gets them in the door in thousands and thousands and huge numbers. And once they're in the door, we're going to teach them how this thing that they find cool, that's actually from Quebec. And by the way, while you're here, here's some other stuff from the Quebec culture that you might not be aware of. So just a really, really neat approach. And I think it can work. No, that's awesome. But one more thing I did want to talk about, because I think it's appropriate to end on for our conversation anyway. You reference in this, the first time I remember, obviously it's been a while since I read the book for the first time, but I did reread the chapter a couple of times once I knew you were coming on. You talked about a Franco-Michigander who did not know there were French communities in Maine.
Yes.
And to me, that rang really true, because I firmly believe that I could go even to a Franco-American Center meeting and they would have no idea that there's a French community in Detroit. How do we remedy this? How do we get better with the link between us? Because we face a lot of the same struggles, and I think we can really benefit each other if we work together more.
Well, I think that's what we're doing right now.
That's it.
Well, we're building bridges. I think that book, French All Around Us, brought us all together and started the conversations. That's how we met. Continuing to build bridges like this and talking more about projects we do in Louisiana or in Michigan or in Missouri or in Maine and New Hampshire, wherever, then we will create a bigger community and certainly awareness of you're not alone.
Sure.
You're not alone where you are. We are part of a bigger community. And that community is diverse.
For sure.
So we have a different history and we come from different countries. But I think that's what makes it even richer, that diversity. We're really starting to see a big change.
No, and that's so true. It's awesome, because you're right. If I'm going to talk to somebody from Detroit or definitely somebody from New Orleans, their story is not going to be the mill worker story that we're going to have up here in New England. But so much of that story and what they talk about on a day-to-day basis of trying to promote the language and the culture are exactly the same challenges we're facing up here in New England. And the same type of events that are successful there, I think, would be successful up here in New England. And I'm assuming also in Detroit. So I do think that's incredibly important. So this has been a terrific discussion. I would like to again thank Mélissa Baril, the founder of the Caribou lunettes, and the person who's going to be spearheading now the really exciting New Detroit. Now, where can we send people who might be interested in learning more about either the Caribou or New Detroit? Websites, social media, where can we send them?
All of that. So websites, cariboualunettes.com and new-foundation.org. And we are on LinkedIn, on Instagram, on Twitter, not Twitter now, X, sorry.
X, yeah.
X.
It's going to be a while before I can call it X, yeah, for sure.
And Facebook. So yes, I think you can find us quite easily, and we will be absolutely pleased to discuss and get in contact.
Awesome. And Mike will make sure to link all of those in the show notes for this episode. Melissa, thank you so much for joining us.
It was my pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair, to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never dies, our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josie Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at josievachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.